Okay, all right, really loud already. Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Fantastic, okay. My name is Jean Wakely. I'm past president of St. John's Women of the ELCA. And thank you all for coming tonight. We had so many choices tonight, and so I'm just so happy to see this room full for this speaker tonight. I'd like to take a moment to read St. John's land acknowledgement. St. John's Church stands on the ancestral homelands of the Wapekute Band of the Dakota Nation. We respect and are grateful for the generations of Native people who have cared for this land. Now I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize the members of our ELCA Justice Education Committee that are responsible for putting this program together tonight with our impressive slate of speakers. And this year, if you'll just pop up real quickly, Joe Franklin, Don Tomerdahl, and Michelle Kramer-Prevost. If you just stand up so they can see you. Let's give them a hand. They have just brought such a rich amount of courageous conversations, or as somebody in town called us, outrageous conversations, whichever, it works for us. Please feel free to help yourself to our buffet and coffee and treats, and the bathrooms are right across the hall through that door. So just get up, do whatever you need to do at any time. There are a few announcements before we get started. There are ELCA books at the registration table describing the ELCA work here at St. John's and the contacts for our committees and special groups. Please take one if you are interested in joining in some of the services, projects, and activities and field trips hosted by the women of the church. We have a free will offering basket at the door. ELCA maintains a fiscal independence from St. John's Church. The funds help support our Courageous Conversations programming and many other outreach programs that the women of St. John's carry out throughout our local community and throughout the world. I would also like to bring your attention to the registration forms of the ELCA Cannon River Conference that St. John's is hosting on May 11th. We are able to book a nationally recognized author, presenter, and ELCA woman herself, Dr. Jacqueline Bousset. You are not going to want to miss this. Sign up as soon as possible, as we think this will be a sellout crowd. All this and lunch as well for only $15. You can pick up the registration form at the table in the back. And don't forget that our mission morning is just 16 days away on Saturday, April 20th, 9 to noon. We hope to see you there. There are lists of things we need donated, and it's not too late to do that. Please bring your donations no later than Friday to be counted, and the donation list is on the women's table out in the, what do they call that? The ante room? What is that? The lobby. There we go, the lobby. Tonight's program is being recorded for our Courageous Conversations Library of Speakers, which you can find on the St. John's website. We will have a Q&A following the program, and you are welcome to stand up to the microphone here on the side with your questions. And now I would like to introduce Joe Franklin, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, to our sixth Courageous Conversation event. And I have to say, I just learned that April has been designated the month of hope. So here we are, right on point. Our theme for this year, Hope is a Muscle in the Midst of the Struggle, was inspired by scientific research around the notion that hope is more like a muscle than an emotion. The belief that your or our future can be brighter and better than the past, and that you or we all have a role to play in making it better. Our speakers this year have presented us with brilliant examples of how individuals have used their personal gifts to creatively confront injustice, from personal or cultural biases to systemic, institutional, or governmental unjust policies, and in so doing are creating a better world for all. So thank you for being here tonight. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd like also to invite you to our last event on May 2nd, when Dr. Samuel Lotegelawaki, Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Sociology at Concordia College in St. Paul, will present I Am a Prisoner of Hope. So finally, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy, who's a prominent member of Oglala Sioux Tribe and a trailblazer, the first Native woman within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, or ELCA, to earn a Ph.D. in theology. She has recently accepted new positions as a pastor at All Nations Indian Church in Minneapolis, as well as a visiting assistant professor of religion at St. Olaf College. Dr. Kelly was born in South Dakota, where her Lakota roots have deeply influenced her unique theological perspective. As a dedicated educator, she teaches on social justice and spirituality's role in societal change. Beyond academics, Dr. Kelly actively advocates for marginalized groups and policy changes. Known for her compassion and humor, she inspires change through embracing shared sacredness. Some of you may have already met Dr. Kelly when she taught a community ed course last spring on Native American spirituality offered at St. Olaf College through the Lutheran Center. Others of us had the privilege of hearing her speak last fall at the Women of the ELCA's triennial gathering in Phoenix, where she was featured as one of the keynote speakers. We're thrilled to have her here with us tonight to share her story, From Trauma to Triumph, Cultivating Hope and Resilience, a Lakota Perspective. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy.
Okay, that's going to be really loud. Will it interfere, do you think?
It's going to pop.
Well, at least he warned you, right? Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here tonight. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy. My Lakota name is Mato Washte Winyan, which means good bear woman. As mentioned, I am from the Oglala Lakota Sioux Tribe. Now, you're going to hear me say Dakota, which is what we're more familiar with in this area, and then, of course, Lakota, and then there's Nakota. And the only difference, it's a dialect, actually. We are all part of the Sioux Nation, and so when I talk about, and I will kind of sometimes intermix the Lakota versus into the Dakota, it's like if you were, let's say if you were like from Boston, or you heard a Boston accent and let's say a Texas accent, right? You kind of know where they're from. That's the same with us. And so we have this way of being able to tell, like, it's like my mother's superpower, being able to tell where someone who's part of our Sioux Nation is from by a lot of times just their last names. But you will hear a very prominent, it's a D or an L or an N in our language. And so that's really what it is, right? There are distinct similarities within our tribes because we are a part of the Sioux Nation, but also we have our different histories, right? Because we're coming from kind of, different geographical areas as well. And so I wanted to start us off with something. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more in just a minute, but this is a practice that I do with my students, and so I have really been enjoying. I teach 2 classes up at St. Olaf right now, and it's like the morning class is a bit more quiet. I think it's because they're waking up. We're in a basement. And I always tell them, it's like, when you stand up to do your presentation on Thursday, start talking because it's really strange when nobody says anything and they still sit there. But one of the ways that I have found to get them talking, and in my afternoon class, they love this, is we do a spiritual practice, right? And so one of the books, and I think I will show it in a bit, but this comes from actually one of my mentors, from Stephen Charleston. He is a retired priest and bishop from the Episcopal Church. He is from the Choctaw Nation. And if you find him, he is extremely active on Facebook. So if you're looking to follow somebody, He does amazing meditations and prayers and things like that. He taught at Luther Seminary long before I was there. But so we have been reading from his new book. Every Tuesdays and Thursdays in my class, every morning, this is how we start off. Because for me, when I teach about indigenous spirituality or this worldview, you have to note that there's over 574 different tribes in the United States, which means there's over 300 different languages and all these different worldviews per se, but we do have things that there are some commonalities. But again, we have our own languages, histories, customs, and all those kind of things. However, there are some things that just present itself in a Native worldview. And one of the most important things in a Native worldview is about reflection. It's a very common theme throughout everything that we do, and as Christians, then it's pretty easy for us to follow that, right? Because when Christ taught us, Christ didn't just give us the answers. We kind of have to find our way to those answers, right? It's not all that easy. We have to work through it. We have to each decipher what we're hearing and how it's talking to us. For us as Indigenous people, a lot of it's that way. So I love using, right now I'm really enjoying his new book. It's called Spirit Walk. And so this is the one that we used this week. It's called Handprints of the Heart. And it says, we are called each in our own way to do the work of creation, knitting together the many strands of grace that hold the universe together. We each have a task to perform, even if we are not always aware of its true purpose or intent. We may not even know what good we have done until the great cycles of love turn round and we discover the blessing we have been. When the curtain parts, we suddenly feel the cool air of heaven billowing about us, and for only an instant, we know that we have made a difference. We are called to be what no other can be. The handprint of our heart on the long walls of time. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this type of spiritual practice, but what we do is, I'm going to give you just about a minute to talk at your table. And what is something that stood out to you? I know I should have made it bigger, it's about as big as I could get. But what is something that stood out to you? What are you hearing? How is God talking to you? See, the thing is, God speaks to us in so many different ways. I find, because I'm such a huge book nerd, but when I am reading, God just pops out of the pages. It doesn't mean it has to be just the Bible or a theological book. It can be anything. So I want you to just take about a minute, and I want you just to have a conversation, if it's the person next to you or however you want to do it. But what stands out to you? Talk amongst yourselves. Okay, I said a minute. I'm really good on that. When I was in Phoenix in the fall, they told me I was going to lead daily Bible studies for 1,500 women. I was like, how do you do that? It's not an easy task. So this is the book. It is called Spirit Wheel, Meditations from an Indigenous Elder. It just came out this past year. But honestly, if you are looking for something where he just has these very short meditations like this. And I find that I kind of just opened the book. I'm not a person that sometimes starts from the beginning in a book. But I would love to hear from a couple of people. What stood out to you in this? What were we hearing? The first person that looks away from me, I always pick on, just know that.
We only got as far as introducing. But what I was going to say, when you called time, that one of the things that I really heard was, we may not know what the calling is, or what we're supposed to be doing, or even whether what we're doing is something that is going to be God kind of thing.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone else? One more. Yes.
Well, as a knitter, I was drawn to the third line, knitting together the many strands of grace, and it had, for me, the same beauty as the first sentence. We are each called in our own way, but we are all different. Woven together, many strands, some bend all different colors, and there just was sort of a stagnancy that for me in the words.
Right. Yep, go ahead.
As a meteorologist, I was drawn to the cool air of heaven billowing about us. For the reason that I felt that. And if you've ever felt, in the tropics you get it a lot, but the air will billow around you and kind of talks to you.
Right.
It's pretty special.
And if you honestly, if you get this book, I mean, I'm really plugging it for him apparently, but he does that. It's how he describes things. It's he took times doing walks and all these kind of things, right? And it's like you're there with him. There's a beauty in how somebody knows how to storytell, right? Because it brings us in a better way, I think, when we're trying to learn. My students this morning, when they were talking about this, because we've been kind of studying quite a while already on this worldview, but one of the things that we had this really deep discussion about was, where is it? We each have our own task to perform, even if we are not always aware or if it's true purpose or intent. We may not even know what good we have done. Interesting in their perspective, for a lot of those in the classes that are a Christian, right? They grew up in a confirmation where you had to do so many good deeds, right? So many volunteering in the community. It became more, we did that out of my congregation. And I remember having this conversation too, and they talked about how then it doesn't, what you're doing is good, but it becomes a task rather than something that just flows from you, right? That they're counting all the things that they have to do good, in order to become confirmed, which is really great. But it was this kind of, for them, this was like, there are other ways that we can do that good, right? And the other one that they talked about, that we are all called each in our own way. I was speaking at a Wartburg Seminary last year as at their graduation, and I think one of the things I said was, and I am a big proponent of this, is you don't have to be a pastor to do God's work, right? And I think sometimes our young people or people just may get a bit intimidated by that, but you can be doing anything. Right? You could be working at McDonald's or knitting every week or doing whatever it is or telling the weather, right? But there are ways that God speaks to us. And it's about learning to recognize that you really hold that wisdom of God within you, because we know that. And I'm going to get into that in just a little bit. But that's where that hope comes from. My niece did this talk for one of her classes, just graduated from college in Washington State, and she did this talk or something, and she had sent me what she was going to say, and she talked about me, and she said my auntie is the first Native woman theologian, and not just the ELCA, and she said that there alone is hope. This is the hope of our ancestors when they felt like there was so much disparity, so much trauma, so all this hurt and pain happening. They still held on to that hope. And it was because they did. And the resilience of the people in my family and in the tribes in this area, I'm able to stand here and then graduate 2 years ago with my Ph.D. and stand in a church 2 miles away from where my grandmother was imprisoned for just being her, right? So it's learning to understand, as my work really revolves around, for me, I understand, I grew up very traditionally, and I also grew up in the church. Often, my question usually, it's not like, most of my friends will get like, when did you become a Lutheran? Have you always been a Lutheran? I get, when did you become Christian? Right? I was baptized in the Episcopal Church. I would say I'm Lutepisc. Little Lutheran, little Episcopalian. But for me at home, there was no either or. I didn't have to balance it. It was everything that I knew and the wisdom that I learned as a traditional Native person in our ceremonies and the spirituality matched what Christ taught us. So I didn't have that balance. It was when I went outside of our home that I began to have to learn how to walk in two worlds. And so I didn't want that anymore. And there were so many people, Native Christians, who began to kind of learn and teach the hurt that had happened to Native people. And I wanted to do more than that. So they did a great job at naming the hurt. People like Vine Deloria or George Tinker. Then we have people like Stephen Charleston, Randy Woodley, and a lot of others, Richard Twiss, who said, well, the pain has been named. This is how we see God, right? But then there was still, at the time, there was still some of that comparisons of, here's the story of our people, or here's my story, and then in let's say, the book of John, we can find it here. For me, that wasn't good enough because we were still trying to fit our story into that narrative. So then I came along and said, God has always been there because that's how I was always taught. So I shouldn't have to find or make my story fit into the Bible, right? Into what we've learned. That we can hear God in that story without having to say, you can find it here. And so that was how I began to do what I called the gospel narrative. It took me 2.5 years to figure out what that even meant. I remember one of my mentors, Dirk Lang, cute little guy about this big. He used to be an Episcopal monk. Really just an amazing person, but he's all about worship. Like, I love worship. And I'm a liturgist on my, because I think if I didn't become this, I really wanted to be like a poet. And I love liturgy because it's so powerful. And you can really change things with people, even when they don't know it. And so worship and liturgy is so powerful. You can get all that in there. And so that's when I realized I was trying so hard to fit this into that when all I needed to do was just talk about this. And God was there. And that started the healing. So I come from, so my son loves this picture and starts to hate it because I show it so much. He is now 11. He's 6 in this picture. This was at my congregation. This was actually taken, my old congregation in Northeast Minneapolis. But this was taken on the day we celebrated I wrote this liturgy for the ELCA when we repudiated the doctrine of discovery in 2016 as a church. And I wrote this celebration for Indigenous peoples. And I remember talking to Bishop Eaton, and I said, it's been about 1 year and some, and nothing has happened. Because we had made these promises to educate and to learn and to celebrate, and it wasn't happening. So she said, go ahead and write it. So I worked with some people, and I wrote this liturgy, I just remembered this day because we had our drum group in, and we had a bunch of the bishops were there, and some of our native leaders and pastors were there, and it felt good. And it was such a great example for my son. Like I said, he's 11 now, driving me crazy. This is my mother, Joanne. So you were just told that I was the pastor. I'm the associate pastor at All Nations Indian Church. Originally, that was just going to be temporary. And then, like what happens when you go into when something happens when you didn't realize what you were missing until it just appeared. And I was so worried about leaving Nativity because I had been there for 10 years. And it was really hard to leave, and I wasn't sure if it was the right thing. And I walked into the doors of my church, my new church, and it felt good. And the problems are so more real world than what I had to deal with at my other congregation. But I could face them. And then I was around people that were like me, that understood the Bible and the stories the way I do. And it just feels good. So I'm the part-time there, and funny enough, my mother is an ELCA pastor. She's now my boss because she's the senior pastor. So we were joking over there because we have quiet little arguments behind the scenes, but I think we understand it, right? And it's not the first time we've worked in ministry together. But it's been a blessing to see because I've learned so much from her. And she is the elder that was needed because the pastor that had been there for almost 30 years, 25 some years, and she died suddenly. And it really hurt the community. And they had been struggling for these 2 years. And they just lost hope. And so it was hard for me to say no and not coming, because I went there to talk with them, do some talking circles, help them with some of the challenges they were having. And it evolved, and it was such a God thing. And it was just a beautiful thing. This is my dad, Gerald. He lives in Montana. One time I accidentally introduced, I said, this is my dad and my stepmom, and then somebody goes, that's a dog. And I went, oh. One of these days I'm gonna get the right picture up there. That's Angus, and Angus is really great. They are ranchers in Montana. They live in Red Lodge, Montana. My mom and dad actually, they're both Oglala, so they came from the both tribe, and our families grew up together. So my parents knew each other when they were little, but unfortunately, divorced when I was young. But they get along really, really well today. And my dad loves to joke that now that he had moved out to Montana, he's been there for some time, but he can finally play cowboys and Indians by himself. He's got a weird sense of humor. My dad does a lot in Indian country as well, and he's a banker, so he's a retired banker, and he helped start what's called the Indian Land Capital Company, which works with Native tribes, and he does a lot of other things. Even though he's retired, he's not, just the same with my mom. These are my siblings. So the one in the center, a lot of you probably know more than anybody, is my brother Sean, who has Owamani. He's an indigenous chef down in Minneapolis. And he's my older brother because he just turned 50. And we like to joke, but he's the oldest one in the family. For his birthday a couple weeks ago, he was somewhere, so I sent him a huge bouquet of dinosaurs for his 50th birthday. But of course, he's leading his own way in teaching indigenous knowledge through food, and also just the history of our nation. On the other side of me, the tall guy is one of my brothers, Ben, who just, he's kind of like a native influencer. I want that job. I wish I understood that more, but it's really cool. My sister on the other side she's in Seattle, and she's an educator. She teaches in elementary and Indian education. My sister behind her, Sarah Beth, most of them are in the Billings area. She is an amazing house mom and a wife. And then my youngest brother, that is Luke, and I helped kind of raise him a little bit because we have a huge age gap. Because some of these are my half siblings. We don't necessarily say that in our family. My brother, Sean, we are siblings with my mother, particularly, but my youngest brother's getting married this summer, and is so excited. And it's funny because he's the youngest out of all of us, and I'm gonna miss those days when I could convince him that there were things called unipigs and all sorts of stuff. You know, you call it on yourself when you're gullible. But and this is my grandmother, Alice. She comes from the Ponca tribe. That's me, that little spark right there. That is my dad's mom. And these are my mother's parents. This is Jeanette and Tom. My grandmother is, she comes from the Santi tribe. So that is my connection here, and I'll explain that in just a minute. My grandfather was Oglala. So this is my grandmother's family. They were, I'll show a bigger picture here in a minute, but this is our family that is connected to this place here. So often when we talk about who is an indigenous to the land, for this area, that is the Dakota people. Now we live in such a beautiful area where we have many different tribes here from other different native nations, but they were pushed or moved this direction, right, as colonization was coming. But this is the birthplace and the story of creation for the Dakota people. So that's important to understand. And this is them in their older life, and I'll show that in a minute. And this is my grandfather. This is my dad, or my grandfather's dad. He was 19 in this picture. You can't see it in this, but when you look at him closely, this is Washikila, or John. He fought in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. My son will talk all the time about my grandpa. He'll talk about his grandpa John, and he talks and talks and talks, and he tells these stories. But who he's talking about is my grandfather right there. Neither one of us knew him. But it's that difference of between that time and space we don't often have as Native people, because we have this understanding of how we are connected. And my grandfather and my grandparents and my elders there and my family, I am here because of them, right? Who I am and what I do now is because of the hope that they had. So wait, is there one of those pointy things on here? Oh, it doesn't work on the TV screen. Of course it doesn't. So the woman sitting down with the umbrella, she's in the black dress, that is my grandmother Margaret Fraser. She was very young during the U.S.-Dakota War. So she and her relatives, that in the middle is Ehemani. He would be her brother. And then his wife is to the right, and then another wife of one of our relatives who were hung in the Dakota 38. So they were young at the time, younger at the time. All of them, of the older ones, were imprisoned at Fort Snelling. My uncle and my grandfather, who's not in this picture, was imprisoned with the 300 other men, not just Dakota, in Mankato. My grandmother, which one of the most interesting things we kind of just found out was we always knew who her mother was through her Dakota name, but we never really had her English name until recently. And I do a lot of genealogical work for our family, and here we found her English name, found out who she was married to, and then found out she's the only full-blooded Native. So if you go into Minneapolis, and if you go towards the Uptown area and the Phillips area, there's a cemetery which was created for dignitaries, for people from Fort Snelling. My grandmother is the only full-blooded Native person buried in there alongside her husband. Her husband was Philander Prescott, so the town of Prescott is named after him. It's been an interesting thing to learn about recently about him. I do a lot of teaching, so I do sacred sites tours, right? And I do a lot of teaching, and I talk about the Traverse des Sioux and all the different treaties that we had that have taken away our lands, right? He played a big role in that. Not necessarily, he was the translator, right? And there's so much more in that history. I could do a whole nother talk. But they were eventually exiled out of the state of Minnesota in 1864. My uncle and my grandfather were then moved from, because they didn't become a part of the men who were hung in Mankato, but they were moved to another prison for about another 3 to 4 years. My grandfather and my uncle were both released. My uncle was able to leave under different circumstances, whereas my grandfather was given a choice, which a lot of Native men were given during that time when they were imprisoned. They could stay there not knowing when they would be released, or they could leave their families, not go back to them. They would have to marry white Christian women. And there was a reason for this. Because at that time, when my grandmother was exiled and her people out of the state of Minnesota, it had become in the entire United States illegal to basically be a Native person. Everything about who they were became illegal. They couldn't speak their own language. They couldn't dress the way that they would dress. They couldn't celebrate their spirituality or practice their ceremonies. They could do nothing. That was just one way of what we call cultural genocide. Another part of that, and this all came from the US government, but another part of that was that idea of, if you want to be released, you need to do this. And the reason they had Native men, and you know, by this time there had been relationships for quite some time with Native people and settlers and colonialists that came in the area for a while, but as things changed and they became a bit more greedy towards the land and other things, so did the relationship, right? But what they were doing was, we are the only people in the entire world that still to this day has to prove who we are by we have to do a genealogical line up to about 6 generations back. So I know my family for a reason, for many reasons. And then what I do is I turn that in, my tribe gives it to the US government, and then the government gives me this little card that I get that basically tells me how much Native I am. They call it a blood quantum. Now, the thing is, the more you marry outside of your people, meaning the more that you were to marry a white person, it decreases your bloodline, and you can no longer be legally called a Native American. So that was another part of the cultural genocide that our people had to face in just so many different ways. But eventually, my family moved to, their first stop was in Crow Creek in South Dakota. It was made for the Santee people after almost 3 years. So when they were at Fort Snelling, they were about 1,700 people. By the time they left Fort Snelling, they were at about 1,300 people-ish, right? When they get to Crow Creek, they lost even more, primarily children. But they lost a lot of people there. It was because if you've ever driven through South Dakota, right? It is, and I never know why people want to live in the middle of South Dakota. But they lived in a place that they weren't allowed to leave the space they were put onto. They had people watching over them, right? They couldn't leave. They couldn't find the food. They couldn't really grow the food because the land there really couldn't grow things. People started dying and they couldn't stop. And then people were starving. And some missionaries did play good roles for Indigenous people, because some of those missionaries were the only voices that Indigenous people had, or ways to be able to get letters and things to their families, right? And so if it weren't for a lot of that help of some of the missionaries that were there, they wouldn't have helped to convince the US government that this place was bad. So eventually the US government says, okay, we're going to have to move them because everybody is suffering, right? It must be bad enough if the US government finally decides that this place is bad. So they moved to an area that's kind of around what's called Santee, Nebraska now. And my grandmother and her people began to rebuild their lives, and many of them stayed there. Some did come back, but she stayed. They created a school, they created a church, they learned to build houses, they learned to sew, they learned to farm and do these different things, right? But they also held on to their practices and their beliefs, but in a silent and quiet way. My uncle finally was able, when he was released, to find his way back to Nebraska and to his family. Whoop. What? Oh, that's where the picture went. See, I was looking for a slide. There we go. So my grandfather, I grew up in Batesland, South Dakota. This is called, they call it the Sand Hills. And if that says anything, it really does tell you what it is. The sand hills were beautiful like this. It was this golden green grass. This is actually at the top of the hill of my grandparents' ranch. And you would see this. This is what you would see. But the problem is, of course, Native people got moved into places where nobody else wanted because nothing could grow. So they were moved here, right? Our family was moved here on this reservation in Pine Ridge. And so you couldn't really grow things. So my grandfather and his dad became ranchers, right? And so they were right in the middle of the homestead. And then my uncle and his family were about maybe an eighth of a way down the road on the ranch, down this little hill. And then about 2.5 or so miles up the road on this long dirt road, it was my family. And then about a mile from us was my uncle and his family. And then bookended on our ranch was a little village called Wakpamini, which was one of the original areas of where the Oglala people, when they were kind of moved onto the reservation, that was one of the original places. And then a little town called Batesland, just kind of one of those unincorporated places, right, where it just doesn't have a lot of houses or anything, but that's where our school was. And my mother would go to work, and she would often drop us off if it was either we were going to go to school, the bus picked us up at our grandparents', or if just babysitting, right? We were always at my grandparents'. There was me and my brother and my cousins, and they were all boys but me, right? And I was about 6 years old, and my mom had dropped me off, and my grandfather was a rancher, so often what my grandfather would do was he would get up about 4 o'clock in the morning, and he'd go out and he'd open the pasture, the gates to the pastures, and let the cows in, bring the horses in, or all the stuff, right? So he'd go out and he would do that. And so then Mom would drop me off kind of early, and by that time my grandfather still hadn't come in from the first part. So I remember going into the kitchen, and Grandma is working, and she would do breakfast every day, and she would make enough for everybody. People would just stop by, and they would pick stuff up, right? Whether it would be my family or somebody from the village just swinging on by, or she'd give breakfast to our bus driver, right? So Grandma would do that, and my job was to make the oatmeal for the pets. So they got oatmeal with like bacon grease, so fat, happy pets. And then coffee. And I joked because at my last church, the ladies wouldn't let me make coffee anymore because my grandfather taught me that if your spoon doesn't stand up in the coffee, it's not strong enough. And then I learned at my new congregation that every time I was making coffee in the morning on a Sunday, one of our ladies would come in and she'd dump it and she'd make new coffee because I made it too strong. So, but that was me. So I remember my grandpa's coming, and I see him coming in his Chevy truck, and he had this kind of tan Chevy truck, and he's coming down the dirt road. So Grandma's like, well, get him a cup of coffee. And see, my grandpa had one of those mugs, like, and this mug he was in the Navy, and he fought in the wars. And he kept this mug, and I guess this is a thing for Navy people, like, you have your coffee cup, they stick to that coffee cup, right? But it was one of those, like, cafe ones, or those old ones with the real thick mugs, right? Those, like, are the best mugs, I think. And so I filled it up with coffee, and I go out there, and I'm 6, 7 years old, and I'm standing there, and here comes my grandpa, and I give him the coffee, and he pats me on the head, and he's standing there and looking really tired, but he all of a sudden goes to this sprout, and there's this sprout in the road, and he's standing there, this tree sprout, and he's looking at it. And then he goes to another one, And he did that, and he got to the third one, and he's looking at me, and I realized this is one of those moments where my grandfather is telling me it's time to come and follow. He's not going to talk. He's going to show me. Because I was the only girl, more often than not, I was with the elders, and they usually only spoke Lakota. You see, growing up, I told you how it was illegal, right? It was made illegal in the 1800s for Native people to be who they were. Not until almost 1980 was it then legal again to fully be them in some ways. So they would sit under this awning at my grandparents' house, and they would talk in Lakota. And I wouldn't know what they were saying, but I began to kind of understand at sometimes, but they would always show me, right? So that was that moment. So my grandpa, we're walking and we're stopping at all these places, and eventually we go through, there's this one-level red barn, and I hated that barn because my brother locked me. I'm giving you all the good stuff, remember this. He locked me in that barn a few times, right? I remember crawling under the corral, and we go through that, we go up to this hill. So this is actually looking the opposite direction. On top of this hill, and my grandpa and I sit down, and my grandpa reaches in his pocket and he hands me a piece of candy. Like, and my grandpa was like the coolest, because whenever we would travel, it drove my mom and grandma nuts, because we would stop. If there were 2 to 3 towns in between where we were going, grandpa would stop every single place. And it didn't matter, and we had to get something to eat. So grandpa always had, so I'm sitting there and I'm eating, right? And it had rained the day before. So you can smell, like, you know that smell when it rains and that grass? It smells so good, right? It's so fragrant. And you could just smell it with a little bit of manure, but you could smell the grass, right? And then that little bug just went zip, and it went past my ear really fast. I don't know if anybody's ever had that happen, but like when those little bugs can fly right by you, right? You hear it. And then there were these 3 little birds flying, and they were just squawking, and they were teasing this chicken hawk. And that chicken hawk was being really noisy. And then you could hear the horses stomp and their tails swaying. And it was just life. And we're sitting there, and pretty soon my grandpa says, well, you get to choose where we're going. I'm going to go down that way. And he points to this big, long tree belt. You see, if you drive anywhere in farm or ranch land, right, you'll often see those long tree belts, which are created to help protect the land from kind of the harsher weather, right, a little bit. And so that was my place. Like when I wanted to not get stuck in a barn or on a haystack, which happened a lot, I would go down to this tree place, this little forest. And it was about as wide as this, but it was about a half mile long. And so imagine this 6-year-old little girl in pigtails, and I'm going along, and my grandpa's following me, and we're walking down there, and we get there, and he had never been there with me, and I go to this spot, and there's this tree, and this was like my spot, and it had that curve. Like you could sit in it, and you could snuggle into it, and it's like it was hugging you, right? That was my spot, and I was so excited. My grandpa, he's sitting down next to me, and he asked me why we were there, and I'm telling him this is my favorite place, right? And I'm talking away. Pretty soon my grandpa looks at me and he says, Kelly, we have to cut the tree down. And when you're 6, and you just said this is like my best friend, I'm crying. And I remember crying, and I am running. I start running, and I'm pretty sure I woke Canada up by this point, and I'm running to my grandma, and she's standing on the front porch, or we had this little stoop, and she had her hands on her hips, and she was a smaller woman, and she's standing there, and she had just gone to, every week she would go and get the curlers in her hair, and she'd go to so her hair is still in the curlers, and she's standing there, and hands on her hips, and I think she was assessing, okay, Kelly's not hurt, I don't think, and I remember they had this wooden screen door, and I slammed that door open so that it would slam shut, and I ran past her, and I jumped on the bed, and about a minute later, I could hear my grandma go, Dad, what did you do? And she was mad. And see, my grandma had ways of telling how my grandma felt about my grandpa. So she called him Grandpa or Pa. He's like, good, she really loves him. Dad was one of those, you did something. Not quite sure, but there was something. And then there was Tom. I only heard Tom, my grandfather was the president of our tribe, and he was a judge, and often only in public, and so honestly, growing up, I always thought he was in trouble a lot. Eventually, my grandma comes in and she says, Kelly, you need to go out and you need to talk to your grandpa. But I'm a 6 and stubborn, still am to this day, and she says, you gotta go out, and I'm like, nope. She says, you need to go out and talk to grandpa. And so I go out, and I'm stomping through the old creaky house, slam that door open, and my grandpa's standing there, and I kind of scared him, and he turned around and he looked at me, and he's wearing these old Wrangler, he had these boots and these old Wrangler jeans about this color, kind of baggy but dirty, and this red and black flannel. And my grandpa had silver hair, very short, and he'd wear these little cowboy hats. I think most of you in here will remember Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid, Paul Newman, Robert Redford. You know how they used to wear their hats, and they kind of had that little bit of a swagger because they had it crooked a little bit. That was my grandpa, right? And when he turned around, the sun hit him. And when the sun hit him, it hit his eyes. See, my grandfather had gray eyes. And that sun hit him, and in that moment, I couldn't be mad anymore because my grandfather is probably one of the most important people in my life. And I even remember standing there thinking, crap, I can't be mad at my grandpa. And he looked at me and he said, Kelly, what do you see? And I thought, oh, not this again, right? And he said, no, what do you see? So then I thought, fine. And I stood there and I said, I named everything for him because to me, there was this little body of water on the ranch. It was just this little pit of water. It had a name. All the trees, I could give you their names. They were my aunties and my uncles. All the dogs have names, of course, but they were my relatives. I could name you every single cow, every horse, every body and spot of land. But there wasn't one moment during that time that my grandfather stopped me and said, Kelly, you can't call that tree your auntie or that horse, your cousin, right? And I kind of silently named a dog after my brother, but that's another story. But it was because of how I grew up. I grew up with this understanding that we are never alone. See, in Lakota, we have a phrase, or it's more like a prayer. We say, Mataku awasi. And it's this understanding of how we are all connected, right? And we hear this all the time, like every time I go somewhere, it's one of the first comments about how Native people are so connected to the earth and blah, blah, blah. And I think, ugh. If you're paying attention in confirmation class, you will learn that we all are a part of creation. You just have to listen more carefully, right? I grew up with that knowledge. But the thing was, we didn't put ourselves over. I was taught we didn't have dominion over creation. We are a part of creation. And that's a big difference. So for me, it was normal to call that tree my ancestor, right? To be able to talk to those sprouts or to name the birdies and all the things because they are a part of me and I am a part of them. And that was something that I learned before I was 6. It was this understanding that God created us to be community. And if it weren't for people like my grandmother holding on to that wisdom and not forgetting it, because not every Native nation in the United States is able to recall a lot of that wisdom, right? But they were able to hold on to that. That I was able to be taught this wisdom that makes me a part of community. That when we experience trauma and we experience all these things, we're built with hope. You see, in Lakota we say, there's a word we say, a phrase we call lakol wichoa. And what this is that it is this, as it says up here, this carries a belief that when words are spoken, that the person who is speaking, that speaker's soul, right? That speaker's spirit are attached to those words. So when my elders were speaking, when my grandparents were speaking, when my mom speaks, right? Their words, we take them seriously because of this understanding, this connection. And as Christians, we can relate to that as well. Because God, right, when we hear Christ speak, we hear God speak. That the words that came out of the people that we learn about in the Bible, God is in that. And for us as Indigenous people, as Lakota people, that was the same understanding. So when we were walking, I almost forgot to tell this part, people always say, then what happened? So when we were walking, what my grandfather was doing was when he stopped at each one of those sprouts, he was actually talking to them. And he was thanking them, but you can't have a tree grow in the middle of the road. So my grandfather never just pulled things up, right? He actually would dig the trees up, or the sprouts, and he would move them into the tree line. So that's how that tree line maintained its life, right? Because everything had a purpose. Everything had a purpose. And so I remember him pulling out this hanky. I was beware, because sometimes like the hankies that my grandma, but in this hanky it had some tobacco and it had some sage. And my grandfather had me go to each one of those sprouts and pray and give them names. And then we went to the tree, and the reason the tree had to come down was I didn't know, but it was rotting, right? And it was gonna fall over. So my grandfather had to cut it down, but it tells you how spoiled I was because my grandfather made it into a treehouse, or some of the wood, right? My brother couldn't go up there. But what he taught me to do that day was learn how to walk in prayer. What it meant to be intentional in understanding my surroundings and that connectedness to it. Like it was those things that I learned. And it's those words, whether they're spoken or not, when we hear them. When I read letters from my grandmother who's passed, right? When I hear these stories and I recount them, my grandfather's still attached to that story, that I feel him. That's why I can literally smell and see and recount it so well, because I haven't forgotten it. See, there's this thing called generational trauma. This concept of trauma, it kind of extends beyond just our personal experiences of grief, right? Of loss, of distress, of all of that. It's this kind of, it encompasses this, and it has this profound impact on individuals, but also communities. And then what happens is it gets transmitted across generations. You see, God created us in some really beautiful ways of how we are connected, quite literally. And so the trauma is able to transcend those generations, right? And generational trauma is this kind of form of this injury that's inflicted upon the body, but the soul as well. And it's not just a single event, but it's this ongoing legacy of oppression. It's a trauma that it lives in our societies and in our institutions, but it also lives within our bodies. And it's a reminder that fight against the trauma is also a fight against the systematic injustices that perpetuate it. Right? That how often do we kind of begin to address these kind of issues? It's really hard to understand it when you can't connect to generational trauma. But the first step of acknowledging it is the acknowledgement of it. That we need to learn how to acknowledge the historical and intergenerational trauma that we experience, and that how it exists within ourselves, but within our communities. And this acknowledgement isn't necessarily just about recognizing the past, it's about understanding how the past continues to shape the present, right? It's about seeing the invisible threads that connect the trauma of ancestors to the challenges that we are faced by being their descendants today. But the thing about understanding this trauma, this generational trauma, is that there's healing possible. Because it requires these three things of courage and compassion and a commitment to learning to confront the uncomfortable truths of our shared history. Right? It's that I want you to not just attend this, right, and then come back and maybe come to my tour, one of my tours this summer or something like that, and then you come back and think that was really great. I want you to do more, right? That you are motivated to do something more than just listen to the stories. That you learn to embrace that the wisdom of those who have walked this path before us are actually walking with us as we walk together towards a future where trauma doesn't no longer define our communities. That is the hope that I have as a Native person. But most importantly, it's understanding about our connectedness. This is one of my favorite pictures. You see, when I talk about how God has created us in a way that, in just like, God is amazing, right? So we know that the world is made of water. We know that we are made of water. So when we are in our mother's womb, for 9 months, right, we are immersed in water. Scientifically, it has been proven in different ways that water holds memory. That water carries those memories, that water carries the stories, that water carries the stories of the land, and it transmits it all over the world, right? So that water, those stories are building who we are. And when we are, as Christians, we look in the Bible, we see the importance of water. We know that is sacred. As Indigenous people, we know that water brings life, right? That the blood that runs through, one day I was missing my grandma Sherman, and then all of a sudden, I had this memory, and I realized that I'm not actually alone. That the blood of my grandmother, although sometimes I can't pull back on those, I can't pull those memories out anymore, she is literally running through my veins, as well as all my ancestors. And then our stories are a part of us. Isn't that beautiful how God has made us? Right? That all of that has formed us to not ever be alone. And then we are born, and that water flows back out into the world, and so does our story. Now our story of our creation becomes a part of the world, right? There is this beauty in how God has created us to always be in community and to be interconnected with that community. And if there is one question, like one of my students today was like, as we were looking, at one of these books, and right, the two classes are going different directions now, but we talked about what does that mean to be fully human in the world. I gave them this question at the very beginning of the year, and they're going to get it at the end. And we came back to it today because somebody brought it up, and their minds are starting to change what that means. What does it mean to be fully human in this world? As we're learning this new worldview, they're starting to understand the connectedness, that it isn't just a thing for Native people, that we have been created to be connected so that your pain is my pain, that my celebrations are your celebrations, that when the world is hurting, there's a reason why we have people protesting at Standing Rock or Line 3 or all these other places, right? It's because they understand that this is their relative, that we are no longer outside of that narrative of creation. We bring ourselves into the narrative of creation. And that is where that hope comes from. So the last thing was prayer. One of the biggest things that I have learned by my conversations with my elders, so when I wrote my dissertation, it drove my advisor crazy because she would say, well, we want to put this in it, and then say, let me talk to my elders. And then the elders would go, mm-mm. And I'd go another direction. And I think she lost a lot of hair. But there was a reason why I did that, right? That there's this deeply profound and sacred practice of prayer. And as all my advisor was amazing. My elders, we didn't just choose things for me to write about, right? There was a ceremony about how I did my dissertation. They really, truly brought prayer into that whole practice of it, which makes me always really nervous for people to read my dissertation because I wrote it very differently. I didn't write it in this kind of academic way you would typically have to write a paper. And I was really nervous about the people that wrote or that were going to read it at first, and they kind of pushed back at first. But all along my way during my Ph.D., I'd read the books they'd want me to, but whenever I wrote something, I only put Native people in it. And it was being very intentional. And so when I wrote my dissertation, I wrote it in story. And then I had to put Bonhoeffer in because they told me I had to put a Lutheran in it, but Bonhoeffer is really cool. But it was the whole idea and the way that my dissertation was created was through prayer. Because we are a people of prayer, not just Indigenous people, but we as human beings. And in my 25 years of ministry working with children and youth, the most simplest thing I have done was be able to teach all ages how to pray is because of how my grandfather taught me. And it's a breath prayer, right? That breath. See, the thing is, as Indigenous people, we understand that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit resides within us. But not just us, everything. The birds and the bees, the water, the land, the trees, the air. God is a part of everything. And because of that, if we don't know what to say or how to pray, all you have to do is breathe. Because not only are you breathing that, you're just letting that air out, but you're breathing the prayers of your ancestors. And God, because God is a part of us, God knows exactly what we need to say. So sometimes when those words aren't easy to come by, you just breathe. And that, I think, out of the biggest thing that I have ever been given from my family is that I wasn't a mistake, that God created me exactly how God intended me to be as an Indigenous woman. That the way God spoke to my people, see, it wasn't hard for my grandparents, my grandmother, my ancestors to become Christian at those times when we are in a spot where right now there's, I think, a change, and I'm almost done. There is this change that there was so much trauma connected to God, Christ, Bible, anything that had to do with Christianity when it came to Native people. And I still wrestle with people in my own family who are not Christian and keep asking me why. It's because all that knowledge that I just shared with you, we can recognize as Christians because that's how Christ taught us. That means that my grandparents, my ancestors were able to recognize when those missionaries were teaching us about God, they recognized it because they had already been living that Christ-like life long for generations upon generations before it was even introduced. So it wasn't hard for them to become Christians because they got the message. What was difficult in the trauma that has carried through the generations isn't necessarily the word of God or that message of God. It was the messengers. So my work has been to learn how and to teach people how to separate that trauma, to understand that God speaks to us in ways that we understand. Think Pentecost, right? There's such a beauty in that. That when my people talk about the white buffalo calf woman, it's Christ. That when we practice our ceremonies, our sun dancing, our smudging, and all these things, God is there. That we can do these things and tell these stories and know God is already present in that, and we don't have to anymore compare that. That as Christians, we all pray differently. I'm pretty sure we read the Bible and we hear it differently, right? And that is okay because that is God speaking to us. When we are carrying that trauma, think about when you have stress. Have you ever thought about when you have stress in your bodies? Where it is? Like where you feel it? Different stress for me happens in different places. But because that Holy Spirit resides within us, do you ever realize that that's God speaking to us? Telling us to wake up? Telling us what we're feeling, like to pay attention. It's the beauty of how God has created us. That God is always speaking to us in so many beautiful ways. And that is the hope in this story of trauma, is these breath prayers, is understanding how our breath, every breath is a prayer. So the intentionality of God created us and the intentionality of how we approach the world is knowing that just as we went back to that first one of we each have our own journey, right? And that journey is exactly how God intended us to be on that journey. And when we understand that and we begin to open our eyes to these different worldviews, I'm not asking you to completely believe in my worldview, but I think there's a beauty in learning from Indigenous people and really how to be in this world in a more inclusive way. And with that, I think the last thing I'll just say really quickly is that the importance of this hope that I spoke about is that in light of the spiritual and cultural trauma that Indigenous people have experienced, excuse me, there is definitely hope and healing. That, I'm going to take a drink of water now. That the Holy Spirit surrounds me, my people, you, that it connects us with the source of power which allows my people as Indigenous people, excuse me, to be able to survive all this racism that we have experienced, all this trauma in the past and the present. But the thing is that I have seen a shift in the over these years is that we do not pity ourselves. That we celebrate each other's victories, but we also mourn each other's losses. That God gives us the visions of a good life, and that God has given us the inspiration and the hope through our visions of how we want to be in this world and how we are. So for us, when we look at and when you hear, good gracious, I'm done. When we hear land acknowledgements, when you hear these things, right? For me, my final word, land acknowledgements, I think, are a form of activism. So when you look at your land acknowledgement, I want you to look at it and see, does it motivate you? Is it educating you? But more importantly, what is it telling you that you're doing? What are they doing? And teach people, show people, right? Because we are not a people who once walked this land. We are very strong people who are still here and have a lot of wisdom to share. With that, I am done. I forgot how much time I had left, so I went over or I went under, I'm not sure. Are there questions? Yes.
You got to turn that mic on.
Oop.
Joe, can you do it?
Hamatakiapi, Jessica Taylor, Imakiapi, Tintuvita, Ga Rosemount, Edwati. Hi, my name is Jessica Taylor. I am Midwakanton, Dakota, and also White Earth Anishinaabe. And I just want to say that it felt like you were speaking to my soul. Like I came here with my sister. I'm Native American. I was adopted by a white family, and we grew up in South Minneapolis. And so I grew up Christian, but also not feeling like I fit in. Like I felt like I didn't fit in with the Native kids that I went to school with, and then I went to a private school. I didn't fit in with the white kids. And so I've always struggled internally with being Christian and Native. And so when you talked about how you've always just been both, and you never like had had to like reconcile that, that was just really beautiful to hear. Just really beautiful. And I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to share that I've been Christian my whole life. I was baptized when I was young and rebaptized about 10 years ago. But the last couple of years, I've been very, very angry at God for just some various things. I just went through a divorce and some other stuff. But and I started going to ceremony, like with my tribe, and I started praying to who I would call Tumkashila, which is grandfather in Lakota. And I started praying to Tumkashila about how mad I was at God. And eventually that brought me back to God. And it's crazy because people are like, well, you were praying to God the whole time. Like that is one and the same person. So I guess maybe I do have a question, like, do you believe too that like when natives are in ceremony and we're praying to the Creator and to Tumkashila, that we are praying to like the same Christian God, to like the same?
Yeah, and I definitely, I asked that question. I mean, growing up, like I said, I grew up, I was blessed to be able to grow up and learning and understanding, our ceremonies and going through all those things. And part of my paper and writing this is one of my mentors who is not Christian, who is a holy man from Rosebud, and he remember asking me when I asked him to be a part of just mentoring me. I remember saying, he said, "Who is God to you? Like who is Tumkashila?" And so I just explained to him kind of the ways that I talk to you today, right? That I've always just is my understanding that God isn't everything, right? But we all experience God a little bit differently. And that's okay. And I just kind of went through that, and he affirmed for me that is true, right? We have often, I think, we label God and how we should communicate with God, or what we should call God, or all of those things, right? And I mean, I grew up with fighting back at that a lot, because I grew up kind of a lot like you. I mean, wasn't adopted, but I grew up in a very white community. And it was a big struggle for me. Like my son is doing much better now, but I had a hard time. And I have students who come into my classes who are Native, but kind of grew up disconnected from understanding those ceremonies and our traditions and things like that. But the thing is, those traditions, those things that who you are, regardless of what you learned or didn't learn, are a part of you. And when you begin to connect to that, you realize that some of the things that you have always done, it's connected to your ancestors, these little things. I had one of my students who's Anishinaabe, she was like, I grew up in the city. She's like, we didn't have that, we just didn't. And but she's like, now that I think about it, like these things that I've been doing, or the way that I process, or how she talks, or how she understands and sees the world, right? It was like, it was just automatic for her. And then she started to realize, like as she started to study her people, she's like, wait a second, right? That we are actually not disconnected from all of that. There are times we take a break, but I think sometimes, like I had to in college, because it was just tough. I was mad at the world. But yeah, for me, and I'm glad you're here, thank you. I just grew up with, I'm glad that I had people to tell me that God is always there for me, like is always present. For me now, it's just been learning to recognize it. And for me now, it's learning to understand. And plus, like even like in ceremonies, right? People do ceremonies different ways, and that's okay, as long as that you're doing it, right? It's those spiritual practices that you do and however you do it. Because as Sioux, right? And the thing with Sioux, people will always say, well, Sioux is like this derogatory term. Unfortunately, it's not, which is great, because we used to think it was, because you think it came from a word called Nedadwasu, which when the French fur traders first came in this area, they saw the Sioux, but they didn't know who they were, and they went to the Ojibwe, and they're like, who are those people? And they said, well, they're the people that live at the snake at the bend of the river, right? So they call them snake people, right? But they thought it was derogatory, and it wasn't. They were just describing the people, and eventually it became Sioux. It's amazing. I love history. Sorry, I'm a big history buff. But, it's over time, like things change, and how we see the world, or how people explain us, even sometimes how we're supposed to be Native in certain ways, or how we do things. And you be who you are. And I think for me, that's the biggest lesson I've learned, is this is who I am. And I'm still learning traditions and teaching traditions and doing these different things, but Takashala, or Wakantanka, or however you want to say, or God, I believe is fully, God is everywhere. God is whoever we want to explain God to be, right? And however you want to celebrate God is exactly how God intends for you to talk about God, right? That's how I think so. Anybody else?
So I am the proud granddaughter. I'm the proud granddaughter of Elza Kilsable from Pine Ridge. I am also the very proud granddaughter of Juliana Russell and Bernice McGaw, who were both sent to boarding school. We are learning the horrible heartaches that my grandmother and great-grandmother suffered at the boarding schools, that they were forced there. My grandmother watched 4 of her brothers die on the other side of the fence because the girls were on this side and the boys were on this side. Those are the things we have learned that no one talked about. So when you hear people talking about the forced boarding schools, people are like, oh, that was wonderful. They got to go learn how to sew and to cook. They didn't get to go learn. They were forced to go and learn. My grandmother was an amazing cook and sewer and all of that, but she was forced to learn all of that. She was forced not to know what a Sundance was. And because of that, we weren't allowed to learn any of that. And when Kelly said, we know our heritage, or we have to prove who we are, I walked out of the house and I turned back around and walked in. On our table, I have my mother's papers to show who she is. Because unfortunately, I have to go back and prove who my mother is so that I can get her number, so that I can get her paperwork together, so that when she dies, I can have her buried in South Dakota on the reservation. So I am proud to say I have 6 generations sitting on the table. Myself is 7. My daughter is 8. My grandson is 9. I'm sorry if any of you can't say you know 9 generations of your family, that you can't say, to know. I am very proud to say that. if any of you happen to see my Peel picture in the book, you will see that I am at the back of the church, at the mirror. And around the mirror, there are pictures. You will see a picture above, half of it, and there are lots of people in it. That is my grandmother and all of my great uncles and aunts. There were 18 of them. I can say I can name 14. If you don't know who you are, take the small amount of what we can give and learn who you are and learn how your lives are so intertwined in the thread of grace that was on that third line. Because regardless if we are Native or not, we are all this wonderful grace that this beautiful woman is giving to us and showing us. And I'm so very proud, Kelly, to know that your family does know mine. Mm-hmm. Because I have two cousins who couldn't come tonight.
We're
who I've
related.
been getting
That's
messages from.
We've got the Magaz in our family, so yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
So,
Thank you. I think this is the one thing that I've been teaching my class, and they're shifting right now, and I think I've scared them today as they start their new project, is I've taught a lot of what I just taught you today, and now I'm moving it to them to where they have to practice it. Now, this isn't cultural appropriation. This is just anybody can learn respect and love and those things, but the most important part, if you take away anything from this, is that in an indigenous worldview, again, this isn't particular in one way or another for people, but it's the understanding of who you are, right? And then it's the understanding of who you are in relationship with God, Creator, the Kanshala, what you want to say. Then it's understanding of who you are with God, you, and the world, the community. And it's this never-ending kind of reflection, right? That we are so connected to our past, which helps us to understand our present and continues to help us to move into the future. But all of it is so interconnected, right? But the thing is to know who you are. Cultural genocide didn't just happen to indigenous people. Y'all, people came into this country because you wanted something new, right? People wanted something better. And they created this kind of melting pot of sorts, right? But as they were creating this country, they began to erase themselves. So often, like when I was asking a lot of kids, students in my class, I'd say, "Where are you from?" And one said, "Oh, I grew up in Eden Prairie." That's great. Where are your grandparents from? Elkhorn, Wisconsin, right? That's about as far as they can go. What do you want people to know about you? How are you passing your story on to your family so that your story continues, right? That how are you telling your story? And that's where my students are right now, is who are they? What do you believe? Why do you believe that? Like, where did that come from? But what is your story? Because your story is just as important, to know who you are. It's the foundation. I mean, they're quite literally built in you.
My name is Dorothea Rosway. Am I speaking loudly enough? Mm-hmm. Okay. I think so much of what you've shared tonight is so important for so many of us to know. It's really important. And I remember the first time I ever went to a Sundance, and we were being taught different things by Native people. And I remember being shocked when I found out that Native people were not allowed to practice their spirituality until 1978. Like, that's shocking. In this country that's supposed to be the freedom of religion, and Native people can't practice their religion, like it's illegal. I was really shocked, and I just think that it's really important that you've shared all that. And I want to let the Northfielders know, and you may already know this, that Larry Martin, did you ever know Larry Martin? He lived here in Northfield. He was an Anishinaabe from Wisconsin. He was taken out of his family as a child and given to a white farm family to be a worker there on the farm and was raised by them. But he went to school and college and grad school, and he helped form the Indian Child Welfare Act and also the Native American Freedom to, what's it called? I forget. Freedom of Religion Act, yeah. Larry Martin, and he lived here in Northfield for a really long time until he died several years ago. Okay. So I think it's really important for Northfielders to know that both that they weren't allowed to practice and that Larry was instrumental in that. So thank you so much for everything you've shared.
And we're still exiled, like people are
True enough.
still exiled. That's why the 4 Dakota tribes were not called a tribe, but we're called a community. Because we are literally still exiled, like it is still in the Constitution that Dakota people are not allowed to live here.
And I think it's important, I'm going to tell you one thing. If you're going to write something down, write this down. Q-tip. It's an easy thing to remember. I think one of the biggest pushbacks or the biggest things that I often get after I speak is I will have people come up who are extremely offended. Know that I don't history shame. I am not here to white shame people. I have the ability now to be able to tell my family's story, which is exactly what I've done, because that is what I can speak for. But I understand that there have been times where it does feel like sometimes as we are shifting in this world that things become, it feels like you're being erased from this history, but you're not, because the history has always been told one way. We are now able to tell a history, the rest of that history. And so the Q-tip, I give this to all the workshops and things I do, means quit taking it personally. Because it's not about you, right? I know it's silly, but it is a simple thing because it's really easy for us as human beings to start to get, there would be something, so what I tell you to do is this. When you start to get the feels when somebody is speaking, even if it has nothing to do with indigenous histories and that kind of stuff, right? Like when somebody is speaking and you're getting those feels, stop for a moment and ask you why. Ask yourself why you are feeling the way you are, right? Don't lie to yourself. If there's anybody that you can't lie to, it better not be you, right? Don't lie to yourself. Answer that question and then just sit on it, right? Because it's important to know that often people don't have those abilities. So like I used to get asked a lot, like when I was very active when George Floyd was murdered. I did a lot of prayers. I started this group called Twin Cities Interfaith Movement Chaplains. We had over 400 people go through this program, but what it was teaching people how to be guests. It was taking the wisdom that I learned growing up, teaching people how to be in those kind of spaces. And then the biggest question I'd get from churches would be like, are those people on the street, are they Christian? Like, why they wouldn't be doing that kind of stuff, right? Ever thought about, like, if you never had an outlet to tell your story or release that trauma? Like, if I had somebody come into my class or even into my office at church, and they started yelling and screaming at me, right? Would I might ask them to leave, right? But we don't have those spaces for us to release that trauma. When we see movements and protests and all these things happening, really, especially during that time of George Floyd and even now, what you're seeing is trauma being released. Because it was the only outlet we could find where we could release it, right? And so, Christian or not, those spaces weren't about angry people or those kind of things. It was a space finally where people were able to tell their stories and release some of that trauma. And so that Q-tip, right? Just remember that one. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one piece. Julie Thorsheim is my name. I've been in Northfield since 1968. Knew Larry Martin very well, good friend of my husband and myself. And I just wanted to add to what Dorothea had to say, that he was raised as a Lutheran. He would have gone to Luther Seminary and possibly did, but at that time, the Lutheran Church said, you know, congregations aren't ready for you. You know, how many times have we heard that about, you know, any number of people or, you know, races? So he could have offered so much more, but we were not ready. Fortunately, I think the ELCA and I think a good many churches are much more universalist in our recognition that we're all children of God, you know, whether we're Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever. But I just wanted to add that piece because Larry, and he has a daughter who's a social worker now, and his surviving spouse is a white woman, a member of St. Peter's Lutheran. And I chatted with her after Larry's death, and she said, yes, he was born before his time, or something like that. So, thank you.
Thank you. I would love to say that we have grown in the ELCA, but we haven't. That problem still exists today. I have a friend. Did you know that it is really common for people of color in the ELCA who become pastors to not be able to find a congregation? That they can go through 10, 20 interviews and still not find one. I had a colleague and friend of mine. She was just ordained this year. She graduated 4 years ago from seminary and consistently could not find. So I would love to say as the ELCA that we're there, but we're not. It hasn't really changed, which is a sad thing, right? But there are some things that are changing, which is, I think, there are schools and people doing reparations in ways, right? I'm very blessed to have met a great person who has given me the opportunity to be able to teach at St. Olaf, right? In a different way where I feel like I am being paid what I'm worth. Because I tell you, I was offered a lot of jobs, but a lot of them were things like, why don't you come for a year? And then we'll see, right? But it was more of a, but we're only going to pay you about $2,000 a month, or you can teach a class, or you can do this, right? And they just didn't, those doors didn't open. It takes people in places, if you have that power, to open those doors, to show other people, because it's important for people like me. I may be the first Native woman theologian, but goodness gracious, it's been really hard to find spaces like this. So, sorry about that. Don't be sorry, just do something about it, right?
Can we give Kelly a big round of applause for coming tonight?
Thank you.
Kelly, we want to thank you for all that you have brought for us tonight. I know that a lot of people are feeling that through their body. And are you going to be around for some chit chat afterwards?
Yep.
Okay, I would like to thank everyone for coming tonight, for all the distances that you came, and for choosing this engagement for us to be involved in tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. Thank you.